So I would almost never recommend going full self-cast for a league start. Brands, mines, damage over time, totems all tend to do better damage while having a much more bossing-friendly playstyle. This build though, IcyHot Freezing Pulse, is the exception, and only because of a series of support gems specifically directed at strengthening self-cast. So at level 85 on a 50C budget by day 1 prices, meaning it's much cheaper day 2 and onward, this build hits roughly 3 million DPS, and then at level 95 on a 200 Chaos day 1 budget, this build reaches roughly 9 million DPS. Both of these numbers get a 10% DPS boost with the inclusion of Vault Haste, something that can and should be teched for bosses given its instant use and no downside. So why is it strong? Well, it's because of self-cast only gems in combination with elementalist resist reduction. So 3.12 brought pinpoint support and intensity, which is an 85% more multiplier for this build. 3.13 brought Trinity, which is a 68% more multiplier, and then Spell Echo is a 53.1% multiplier. And then alt qualities for these gems are pretty strong as well, but I'm not going into that just because of the league start scenario. And then Realm Ender is the sleeper unique that I'm using here. So it's a +3 to gems 7 link that costs roughly as much as a Divine Orb on day 1, as an already linked Realm Shaper, which is the unupgraded version, and then the Prophecy itself is 1 Chaos. And we're actually able to use Cold Fire because that enables Trinity. And then the other 2 core uniques I'm using are Eye of Malice and Malachi's Artifice. So that's a pretty common combination, but this is a really specific use case. So it's not different, but it's just getting greater leverage. So I actually do need the exposure that's both cold and fire because I'm half cold and half fire damage. And then Elemental Equilibrium from my Lightning Golem also reduces both cold and fire. Again, really important for my build. So this is used in conjunction with Elementalist, which is already generically strong, and then offers even more minus resist scaling and some cast speed with golems to make things feel better. There's really no other core items other than the 2 threshold jewels, and I don't even know if you need 2 of them. You might just run with 1 because of how pinpoint support works for clearing. So budget first. You can see there's only 2 really expensive items. First, the Eye of Malice. It was 20 chaos on day 1, but actually day 2 of this league it dropped down to 5C despite how popular Ignite builds were. Realm Shaper as a 6-link natural drop should be around the cost of a Divine Orb as already mentioned. The Prophecy to upgrade it is only 1 chaos. At Series Promise you can skip altogether if you want to. I think it's really great, it gives you Leech, even though you have a ton of regen. And then the 2 rings are, I priced them at 2 chaos each, they could be 1 chaos each, who knows. And that's all still leaves you with 6 chaos to buy, rares for life, resist, whatever. But they don't need to be that good because you have a lot of rare slots left open still to fill out your resists. And then this is, so to speak, the higher end version of it, where I've added in a Frenzy on hit chest. So Frenzy generation is really great. I think it's totally worth it. You might spend somewhere between 20 and 70 chaos, maybe up to 100 chaos for the base. I don't know, depends on who's selling what. But usually you can find a naturally dropped Redeemer base with Frenzy on hit. And then you need the Silver Oil. The Silver Oil that will cost probably around that much. It's been pretty steady for a couple leagues now. Lets you anoint Counterweight, which is that staff node on the left side. And then I've added in the 3 Grand Spectrums, and this still leaves you with 50 chaos for res and life. And I think that you should spend most of this on a good amulet that gives multi and cast speed and life, and maybe some dexterity. You can level this build however you want. You can level it as Freezing Pulse generically if you want to. I wouldn't. I'd probably go with whatever racing setup is the most popular at the time, because it's probably a reflection of what's actually fastest. I might also go Spellslinger if you're not as comfortable with the Armageddon brand Cremation playstyle or the Orb of Storm Stormblast Mind playstyle. This is the normal lab tree. I go for an early pathing to Elemental Overload and Dark Arts. These help you move faster, it scales your damage more easily, and yeah. But when you get to Cruel Lab at level 60-ish probably, and I don't know how many skill points you have, but it's probably around here, and you're taking a Lyra the whole way through, that's when I think you should respect a crit. It's because you get the second golem node, and I think at this point you want to throw in an ice golem in addition to your lightning and flame golems, and that will jack up your crit chance by quite a bit and let you scale multi. You also have more nodes in the tree to actually effectively get multi, which you don't necessarily have during normal lab, and the respec is cheap, it's 2 nodes. Then I have the final respec planned out for level 85, and this is when I would transition from whatever leveling build I'm using into the Freezing Pulse IcyHot bullshit. And the reason I do this now is because I think by level 85 you should have enough currency to buy those 3 relatively cheap core unique items of Malachi's Artifice, Realm Ender, and Eye of Malice. And you can see that I'm taking these staff nodes now. I'm not anointing Counterweight yet. Instead, I'm anointing Heartseeker at this point because it's cheaper. And the tree is really focused around this area. I think that these clusters are really good to get early on. And you can see that this is the item setup I'm using. The other cool thing is that this is planned out, I think at level 85 you probably have level 18 or 19 gems. I'm using level 19 gems here, I just don't really know what level gems are supposed to be at. I know it's not level 20 though. And then Yeah, I don't actually have Frenzy on hit checked off in the config, so this Vol Regalia is fine. Everything else is just life and whatever. I think Gifts from Above is a really good option before you can get really good rings. So I'm actually going to stick with this all the way for this build. And then the leather belt, my 2 threshold jewels, no other jewels yet. I haven't opened jewel socket. I don't know why that's there. And then this will be the final tree for level 95. And I assume that if you go quickly, this should be roughly where you finish at the end of day 1 or early day 2. Hitting about this point. And you can see that this tree is, it looks like a fairly generic caster tree. There's a couple things that are kind of unique that I should point out. Firstly, I'm using this cluster jewel for projectiles. And the only reason I'm going for projectiles over non-damaging ailments or curse or something like that is because it's cheaper. I know that this will be a cheap cluster because it's kind of shit. But repeater's a pretty good node for us. And projectile speed is really great. Secondly is Heart of Ice. Heart of Ice is actually very, very important to get. Most things that you scale will scale both fire and cold damage or just fire damage. Because we're converting. And then cold to fire as a support gem within your realm ender will actually give you cold added as fire, which means that in order for you to proc Trinity, you need to make sure that you're dealing as much cold damage as you can. You have to find different ways to scale cold damage alone, and really one of the only ways to do that is through cold penetration. And Heart of Ice gives us that. It also gives us cold damage leech as ES, and I don't have any other sources of ES leech, so this is actually very, very important. You don't want to miss this, especially when you're using Trinity support. Otherwise, I've now added in 3 Grand Spectrums, 2 first snows are still in there, and then I'm taking these prod speed nodes. I think they're really good. And then obviously don't forget to take intensity, it's fairly important for pinpoint. The skill setup is fairly straightforward. I'm running Frost Shield, which is the slightly unique thing, I guess. For self-cast builds, this helps quite a bit. But otherwise, you can see the chest is just a 4-link for golems. If you have a 5th link, I'd put in Meat Shield. It makes things a little bit safer, although I don't think it'll matter that much, especially if you're not really, really high rolling your maps. At this point, I'm using level 20 gems. I'm hoping for level 20 on Freezing Pulse. You want to level those in your offhand and craft them. And then as far as the items go, I've now put in... Well, this ideally would have a Frenzy Charge on hit. I don't know why I don't have it crafted. Everything else is really boring, normal. You can see my amulet has multi on it. This should be cheap. Finding an amulet like this isn't that hard. The dexterity, you'll have to spread across things. You might have to craft dexterity on a couple pieces of gear, whatever. And then I have the Stygian Vise. They're gonna cost like 10 chaos. Roll it with whatever. You'll hit T1 life eventually. And that's it. It's actually very, very, very simple to set up for the gear. And the gems is nothing special. There's no alt quality. There's not even quality on these gems, and we're already hitting this level of damage, so it's pretty solid. I think the biggest thing that makes this build strong is that for a newer player picking this up, it's very, very straightforward. You only really need 3 uniques, and then everything else is just fill out your life and resistances. The scaling is kind of intuitive as soon as you have the core mechanics in place, and the playstyle is really, really simple. There's no timing, there's no combinations of skills you need to use. It's not like Slam, it's not like Bladefall Blade Blast, it's not like Archmage Formation, and it doesn't feel like shit. Self-cast skills don't feel great unless you're playing like Winter Orb or like Spark, but it still feels pretty good because, it's intuitive. But there are 2 sort of major downsides to this. Firstly is that your self-cast, which is kind of ironic given what I just said, but self-casting does feel kind of shitty sometimes when you're bossing, because you'd rather have auto-targeting or damage over time. The thing is, when you have this level of damage, you should be able to kill most bosses fairly easily, including things like Awakener 9, including things like Double Guardians, and I'll probably be trying to do those boss kills early tomorrow, something like that, or early today, depending on when I upload this. The other downside to this build is actually mapping DPS. Because we're using pinpoint support, the damage is actually kind of low when you're mapping relative to what the damage is when you're bossing, because you're not standing still and casting to get pinpoint procced all the time. Inspiration is also a little bit consistent when you're not casting all the time, which is kind of weird, because you might enter a pack with 0 inspiration charges and you'll need to build those up. I don't even know if it's necessary. I'm going to be running a mana flask, so I might switch that out for controlled destruction. That said, inspiration does give you crit. I think it's a pretty good support overall. I think it's worth taking. Hypothermia isn't already auto-procced as well, right? Because the first hit enemies aren't chilled yet. There's a bunch of things basically that make it so that the initial hit on a single mob won't always be that high. But honestly, you should be able to kill most packs without a problem. As always, anything else you can find in the POV. I'm really curious to know if there's any other really strong ways to scale self-cast that get to this level of damage with this level of investment this early into the league. And at the end of the day, I probably won't be league starting this, mostly because I want to be running other skill gems, but I mean, you can take a look for yourself, right? The items don't lie, the damage doesn't lie, it's a bit squishy, but just play better, don't get hit. And honestly, it's not that bad. It's basically a playable build.